Erev Tov, everybody. Monday night, Parashat Ki Tisa. We completed the instructions of the construction of the Mishkan and the vestments and the inauguration ceremony. And now we shift gears a little bit, and the focus of this week's parasha is the story of the sin of the golden calf and its aftermath. Um, and it's in that direction that Rabbi Avital Hochstein's essay orients itself towards, although she really does zoom out to kind of track a journey in the Book of Shemot. So it's a good opportunity to sort of reflect on bigger themes in the Book of Shemot. Um, no rabbinic literature here. She is the midrash, or the sort of midrashic source, guiding us through some psukim and themes that really have to do with seeing and presence. There's a very rich kind of what we might call a pastoral Torah here to develop from her analysis of the parasha and really of the kind of arc of the developing relationship between Bnei Israel, Moshe, and God in the book of Shemot. So with that introduction, let us begin. From the burning bush to Sinai, and as we'll see in line 3, the English doesn't quite do justice to the Hebrew wordplay. I think I have the Hebrew essay here. Yeah. Min hasne el Sinai. From the bush, the sneh, to Sinai. This is a play which she's not the first to make. Chachamim make this play in various places as well. Um, and the burning bush takes place um, when Moshe is shepherding Yitro's sheep, and it says that he takes them achar hamidbar and winds up el har ha'elohim choreva, the direction of the mountain of God at Chorev, which is Sinai. It's a kind of a circular journey from the burning bush to Sinai. Now, of course, how does the golden calf and this week's parsha figure into that? Um, when we say Sinai, we normally think about the revelation, but of course, more happens there. Bnei Israel spend a year at the foot of Har Sinai, and there's a lot to unpack. So here we go. The book of Shemot is drawing to a close. Our parasha, Parashat Ki Tisa, offers one lens through which to see the book: the transition from the revelation of the burning bush to the revelation of the giving of the Torah, from the Sneh to Sinai. This lens is in fact a prism, nice kind of imagery to think about, which holds a number of dimensions. In the following lines, I will focus on transition regarding vision, that is Moshe's transition from averting his eye to requesting to see more, and transition regarding presence, from a lack of faith in God's presence to presence as testimony of love. That's what we're signing up for here. Seeing at the burning bush. Moshe was shepherding his father-in-law Yitro's sheep when he saw the burning bush. He does understand that there is a great apparition before him, to take ourselves back to Parashat Shemot itself, Exodus chapter 3, right? Moshe leads the flock into the wilderness and comes to Chorev, the mountain of God. The angel appears to him, Vayera, uh, meaning allows itself to be seen. Vayar, Moshe sees, and there is a bush which is aflame, not being consumed. Moshe says, let me turn aside, ve'ereh et hamar'eh hagadol hazeh, and see this marvelous sight. So we have a lot of different manifestations of the verb ro'eh, allowing oneself to be seen in Vayera. Moshe's Vayar, he saw it, and then his sort of intentionality statement, let me take a look at it. And what is the it? It's a mar'eh hagadol, a marvelous sight, literally, thing to see. Then, of course, as she'll follow up, Vayar Adonai kisar lirot, God saw that Moshe had turned aside to look. So vision clearly is a central idea here. So Moshe does understand that there's a great apparition before him, but he doesn't understand its nature, doesn't understand the meaning of the apparition. God explains to him how to behave. Take off your shoes. And also why? For the place upon which you are standing is holy ground. Moshe reacts. Moshe hid his face because he was afraid to gaze at God. And so just taking us through, she jumps over verse 4. God tells Moshe, remove your sandals. God introduces God's self, and then Vayaster Moshe panav, ki yarei mehabit el Elohim. It's interesting that here we have a different verb. Um, Moshe hides his face because he's afraid, not quite the shoresh of ro'eh, um, from habit, kind of gazing. I think lahabit is a more intentional, direct, maybe intimate look, if I had to differentiate it from ro'eh, but that's something which needs more thought. Okay, so Moshe hid his face because he was afraid to gaze at God. In contrast to Moshe, who is afraid to look and shies away from the apparition, for God, looking and seeing at this moment serve an extremely important function. Seemingly, they motivate God, encourage God to put God's self forward and represent God's coming closer. You can see her intentional choice to avoid pronouns for God. That means that you have to say God 4 times in a sentence. They encourage God to put God's self forward and represent God's coming closer so as to avoid saying his, as we would often say. Seeing is a critical component of moving God to go down to Egypt, listen to Israel, and acknowledge their pain, as the next 2 verses here in chapter 3, or there, back in Parashat Shemot, in chapter 3, say, God said, Ra'o ra'iti, I have very much seen, indeed seen the suffering of my people who are in Egypt, and I have heard their cries at the hands of the taskmasters, for I know their pain, and I will descend to save them from the power of Egypt and raise them up from that land to a land that is good and expansive. Seeing is the point of origin for this encounter between God and the people of Israel. So we have Moshe's unwillingness, or not unwillingness, Moshe's recoiling from seeing, and God's very intentional choice to see. Okay, so that we call that section seeing at the burning bush. Now we're on to the experience of the burning bush. At the encounter of the burning bush, Moshe expresses over and over his lack of faith in himself and his doubts as to his ability to succeed in the task that God is placing upon him. Who am I to go? God's answer to this question is simple, for I will be with you, right? You don't have to depend on yourself to go. By the way, a week or two ago, 2 weeks ago, I think, when we gathered to kind of remember the hostages who've been killed, Toby Linhart, a Beit member, shared a beautiful teaching about reactions to heaviness in the book of Shemot. And she pointed out that when Moshe turns to his own heavy-mouthed condition as a reason why he can't go to Egypt, and God tells him, I'm going to be with you, and, I control speech and all of those things, that doesn't compel Moshe. But when God tells Moshe, Aharon will help you, then Moshe feels able to go. And she developed from there a notion that as much as God's presence and God's support is important, we depend on each other to get through times of heaviness. So God's answer, I'll be with you. God promises Moshe to be an accompanying presence and presents. Oh, here we go. Here is a third person masculine singular pronoun. Presents himself, God's self, as present, available, and existent. This is God's reaction to Moshe's lack of faith. And it is also a reassurance about Israel's reaction to Moshe's message, meaning the same notion that I will be with you is how God reacts to Moshe's next concern, not just about Moshe's capability, but about Israel's response. Moshe presents a basic question. What should he do if the people push back and they say to me, what is God's name? What should I say to them? God's answer is cryptic, right? Eheyah asher eheyah, I am that I am. And, you can tell the people, Eheyeh shalachani aleichem, I am has sent me to you. However, despite the mysteriousness in the answer, what is recognizable in the response is a declaration of presence and being, meaning we might not know what God meant by Ehyeh asher ehyeh, but we understand that it's something about being and being with. And that's God's answer to the question of what should Moshe do when the people question who is this God? The answer not is somewhat opaque, but it includes the notion of God's being with. Moshe represents those who might cast doubt on God's existence, and he places words of doubt in the mouths of Israel and Pharaoh. However, he also states that this abstract existence of God is not sufficient. So now we're into chapter 4. Moshe responded and said, "They're not going to listen to me. They won't heed my voice, for they will say, God has not appeared to you." Perhaps just as seeing is what moved God to ally God's self with Israel, so too perhaps Israel need a vision in order to move them to ally themselves with God, right? So God's simply statement of presence isn't Moshe's concern isn't going to be sufficient. They need vision. They need an appearance of God, right? So circling all the way back, that was the very thing that happened at the beginning of the encounter at the burning bush. Moshe shied away from facing that vision. Then God is trying to convince him to go down. Moshe's casting doubt, uncertainty about himself, and imagining that Israel will respond with uncertainty. God says, "But I'll be with you." And Moshe imagines Bnei Israel saying, "But what we gotta see something. Well, how do we know this is all real unless there's a manifest presence and a perceptible presence?" Similarly, when God attempts to calm Moshe's fears about being heavy of tongue and heavy of speech, God both offers Moshe help and emphasizes that God will be with Moshe. Right? God says further on in chapter 4, as the dialogue continues, "Who gives a man a mouth, and who makes one dumb or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not me? And now I will be with your mouth, and I will instruct you in how to speak." Yet Moshe's concerns are not assuaged. He is not even assured by God's promise to be present and accompany him. He doesn't feel capable in the face of this challenge, and he responds to God with the pained "Shlach na biyad tishlach," send who you will send. As an aside, that moment, just as we this is not an essay on Parshat Shmot, although a lot of it takes us back to Parshat Shmot, as they go through their long, lengthy back and forth. Um, and Moshe ultimately says that, shlach na biyad tishlach. Interesting, JPS translates it much more sharply as make someone else your agent. Then God gets angry and says Aaron is coming, and then Moshe is convinced to go. Um, but there's so many different interpretations of the tone and emotion behind shlach na biyad tishlach, and I really like Rav Avital's term here that it was a pained send who you will send. Like Moshe is not being defiant. He's not being it's not a focus necessarily on his stubbornness. It's just that he doesn't feel capable. I think amongst the readings of that little moment, I think this is a very good one. He doesn't feel capable in the face of this challenge, and he responds to God. He wants to be able to help, but he doesn't feel he can, and that pains him. He responds to God with the pained "Shlach na biyad tishlach," send who you will send. Thus we leave the sneh, and of course, because this is not her point, she's left aside that little conclusion about when Aaron is suggested, then Moshe becomes convinced. That's not the sort of relationship she's interested in focusing on here, so she leaves that aside. Thus we leave the sneh with Moshe's hesitation of seeing God and an all-around doubt regarding God's presence. But things have changed. Though Moshe is again a shepherd, he has now, as we come forward to the second half of Shmot, really, or even middle of Shmot, Moshe is again a shepherd. He has traded his father-in-law's flocks for God's sheep, the people of Israel. Sinai is, of course, the place that cements and represents the bond between God and people, but it is also the place of Israel's great betrayal of their God, the sin of the golden calf. In this context, just as he did at the burning bush, the sneh, Moshe finds himself receiving an explanation from God of the reality that he is about to encounter. Right? So it's not God telling him about the suffering of the Jewish people in Egypt that God has seen, etc. It's God describing to him what's happening at the foot of the mountain. Go and descend, for your nation has ruined. Lech ki shichet amecha. However, there are a number of significant differences between God's exchange with Moshe at the burning bush and their conversation at Mount Sinai. In their first encounter, Moshe assumes that Bnei Israel will not believe in him, and God reassures him that they will. At Mount Sinai, the dynamic is reversed. God knows that the people are not believing, are not faithful, and Moshe finds himself in the position of arguing in the defense of Israel, arguing that God should not abandon God's people. At the burning bush, God sees the suffering of the people, and that moves God to save them. At Mount Sinai, God sees the people's rebellion, and that inclines God to want to put more distance between God's self and God's people. But the act of seeing receives new meaning during the atonement process. From a fear to gaze to a request to see. Okay. The sin of the golden calf is the background for a conversation about the love between God and Moshe and between God and God's people. This is the kind of function of, or the content of chapter 33 in our Parashah. This love is described through seeing the good in the other, a subjective seeing of the positive, the finding of favor. God said to Moshe, I will also do this that you spoke about, for you have found favor in my eyes. Moshe, who already saw the burning bush, God's strong arm, and God's great anger. Moshe, who was heavy-lipped and heavy-tongued, is now relying on this intimate finding of favor and takes one more step forward in his close relationship with God and asks, Hareini nat kavodecha, show me your glory. And God responds positively, in a manner of speaking. God doesn't say, you'll see my face, but God says, you may recall, I'll put you in the cleft of the rock and I'll pass over. V'hasiroti et kapi v'ra'ita et achorai. I'll remove my palm and you will see, because she cuts it a little bit short. It's you'll see my back. But nonetheless, the request, hareini, show me, is met with a v'ra'ita, you will see. In the middle of God and Moshe's dealing with the sin of the golden calf and its aftermath, the narrative moves to the placement of the tent of meeting, which is possibly an early iteration of the Mishkan. I'm going to go there to chapter 33 for a moment. Moshe yikach to ohel. Moshe would take the tent and pitch it outside the camp at some distance from the camp. V'kara lo ohel moed. It was called the tent of meeting. And whoever sought the Lord would go out to the tent of meeting, which was outside the camp. Just get the greater context. Whenever Moshe went out to the tent, it seems like Moshe wasn't the only one. Anybody who was seeking God could go there. But when Moshe would go there, everybody would stand and at the entrance to their ohel, their tent, vihi bitu, we have that other verb for looking, they would gaze. Maybe lahabit is a little different from ro'eh also in maybe the duration. Maybe it imagines a longer period of looking. They would gaze after Moshe all the way until he had entered the tent. And when Moshe would enter the tent, the pillar of cloud would descend and stand at the entrance. Well, Hashem spoke to Moshe. When the people saw that pillar of cloud, they would rise and bow low, and God would speak to Moshe face to face, and then would return to the camp. Okay, so just read that paragraph again. In the middle of God and Moshe's dealing with the sin of the golden calf and its aftermath, the narrative moves to the placement of the tent of meeting, this Ohel Moed, which is possibly an early iteration of the Mishkan, right? Even though the instructions for the Mishkan have been given, depending how you read the chronology of the book of Shemot, they've already been given, but they haven't even been transmitted to Bnei Yisrael yet. They're just in God and Moshe's relationship. And yet already there is this tent of meeting of some kind, this potentially kind of proto-Mishkan. Initially, it appears that this act of Moshe's, taking the Mishkan out of the camp, is an act of distancing the holy. Meaning, right, where we read this little passage, and we see that Moshe is going um, to this tent, which is harcheik min hamachaneh, michutz lamachaneh. It's at a distance from the camp. It's outside the camp. It seems like it's a distancing of God's relationship to Bnei Yisrael, at least. People have to go far to get there. Seems like it's mostly Moshe who goes there. However, in the description of the function of the Mishkan after this move, it appears that it has just the opposite effect. It becomes a locus of those who seek God, right? It was anyone who wanted to seek God could go there. Israel is no longer a congregation that expresses a lack of faith and loyalty. Rather, it is full of people who seek God, who are looking for God and God's presence. And so even though it is harchek min hamachaneh, kol mevakesh Hashem yetzei alom await. It's set up in such a way that everybody who seeks God, which we have to imagine if the Torah goes out of its way to describe that this is its function, that it was used. People went and sought God. Not only this, but Moshe says that the connection between God and God's people is dependent on God's presence, contingent on God's accompanying of them. Thus, presence is a mutual quality of the relationship between God and Israel. Not only are Israel seeking God, but God is constantly accompanying them. Think of Rabbi Dr. Heschel's book titles, Man in Search of God, God in Search of Man. How will it be known that I have indeed found favor in your eyes, I and your people? Moses asks. And answers, is it not through your walking with us? And thus we, I and your people, will be distinct from all other peoples on the face of the earth. If so, what had been the riddle of God's existence has transformed itself into a clear symbol of the uniqueness of God's love, before, I guess, or of God's people. We, Moshe explains, will know that you love us, that you favor us when you walk with us, right? So if we started out with, this kind of stage of doubt and, not knowing, now we've come to this place where presence describes love and a mutual connection. Moshe is saying that God's initial guarantee at the burning bush of I will be with you is not sufficient, neither for the faith of the people nor for his own. However, now, after the post-sin reconciliation, God's presence, God's journeying with the people, is testimony not only to the fulfillment of God's promise, but also to God's love. God's mere presence is testimony of God's love. Now, I think this is a key paragraph in the essay, and I'm not totally sure that I got it. It seems right, so I'm going to read it again. Moshe is saying that God's initial guarantee at the burning bush of I will be with you is not sufficient, neither for the faith of the people nor for his own, that they're looking for something more. It's not clear if that something is the seeing God, um, or something more than that. But they need more. However, now, after the post-sin reconciliation, God's presence, God's journeying with the people, is testimony not only to the fulfillment of God's promise, but also to God's love. God's mere presence is testimony of God's love. So it sounds like what she's saying here is the people after the golden calf, the sin and the reconciliation, became satisfied with something that they weren't satisfied with before. The initial guarantee of I will be with you wasn't sufficient, but now, right, they wanted something more. Again, a vision, something more. But now the same thing, the I will be with you, that's borne out through God's presence seems to be sufficient. It's what the people want and it's what they need, and getting it satisfies them at some level. So I think that's what she's describing here. God's presence wasn't enough in stage one. After the sin of the golden calf, that same thing that wasn't enough before now becomes enough. And why is that? One can understand the meaning of this change in light of the sin of the golden calf. God's statement regarding God's presence after the sin demonstrates and testifies a choice of togetherness that is dynamic, a unity that is kept through and despite movement and change, and even in light of sin and separation. It certainly reminded me just in a tiny snippet of the Gemara and Rosh Hashanah, which interprets what God was saying to Moshe right at this time, when God teaches Moshe the 13 attributes of God, and the first two are Hashem, Hashem, Adonai, Adonai, and the Gemara interprets um, that phrase as Anihu kodem sheyechta ha'adam, v'anihu la'achar sheyechta ha'adam, v'yaset tshuva. I am God before a person sins, and I am God after a person sins and performs repentance, which could mean a variety of things. But I think it's often taken, even without the Yaset Tshuva bit, it's often taken maybe a little bit out of context to sort of say God, God's relationship with us is not broken by sin. It can be complicated, it could be fractured um, by sin, but ultimately God's presence is available to us and relationship exists with us, whether before sin or after sin. It feels like she's alluding to that rabbinic notion, especially given that it's an interpretation of the psukim that come from right in our parashah. Um, Here, again, God's statement regarding God's presence after the sin demonstrates and testifies a choice of togetherness that is dynamic, a unity that is kept through and despite movement and change, and even in light of sin and separation. And that somehow is the explanation for why what wasn't enough at the burning bush now is enough after the golden calf. From the Sneh and beyond Sinai. Significant shifts take place during this joint journey from the Sneh and beyond Sinai. Changes in the evolving relationship between people and God. They are compelled by a longing for mutuality. At the Sneh, God presented God's self as one who sees suffering and is moved by it, right? Moshe couldn't quite look straight on at God, but God was looking at the Jewish people and seeing them motivated God to action. But at Sinai, Moshe asks not only to be seen, but also to see God. In addition, at the Sneh, Israel are presented as filled with doubt, and God presents God's self enigmatically as I am that I am, the presence, the God of presence. But at Sinai, after the sin of the golden calf, Israel are presented as those who seek God's presence. And the relationship, again, I don't know, maybe part of what's a little bit challenging here is what's the difference between filled with doubt and seeking God's presence? I guess you could say, I don't really know if you're there, and therefore, but I'm not moving towards you or asking you for something. I'm just expressing doubt, right? Someone says, I'm going to be there for you, or I'm there for you. And you say, I just don't know if that's true. But you don't say, but please show me that it's true. Maybe that's just filled with doubt. And that's a different thing than seeking God's presence. So in Shemot chapter 3 and the beginning of the book, Israel are presented as filled with doubt, but missing that next step of somehow asking for more. They're just questioning. They're not asking for more. But at Sinai, after the sin of the golden calf, Israel are presented as those who seek God's presence, right? Vaya kol mevakesh Hashem is what we saw in that chapter 3, verse 7. Vaya kol mevakesh Hashem, everybody who seeks God, which we're imagining was some significant number of people would go out to that tent of meeting. And the relationship between God and Israel is described using divine presence. God is described as the one who goes with Israel. This presence is more mutual and less enigmatic. It's not this ehiyeh asher ehiyeh, which is something about presence, but it's not so clear. And somehow it's more direct and present. Certainly, the pillar of cloud is a very present presence. These shifts foretell a new connection between God and Israel, one of a subjective love. Seeing and presence join to reveal that at this post-sin moment, Moshe and Israel are liked, favored by God. May we merit seeing that encourages presence and enhances favor, our favor in the eyes of others and theirs in ours. It's interesting, just this last bit on seeing. Um, Feels like it maybe loosely connects back to last week with Titzaveh and sort of our attitude to clothing, and sort of how we look. Um, but again, may we merit seeing that encourages presence, right? Not a sort of seeing or potentially seeing that gets stuck in doubt, but a seeing that encourages presence, and a being seen that enhances favor, our favor in the eyes of others and theirs in ours. So again, this is, I found, I'll take comments in just a moment. This is felt a little bit loose, a set of associations. I think I understood the shift that she was trying to describe. Moshe shifts from recoiling from God's presence to seeking it. The people go from, again, also from kind of doubt to seeking, and God goes from a presence which is enigmatic to a presence which is more clear and relational, and that these are positive steps, and the fact that they happen across, on the other side of a sin, are a testament to the mutual desire for the relationship. It sort of transcends um, uh, fractures in the relationship, and the capacity for it to continue to grow. I saw Scott had a hand. Yes, please.
So it appears to me that we shouldn't lose sight of what happens um, with the golden calf incident, and that um, what is troubling to the people is that Moshe is gone, and Moshe has been their intermediary, their connection to God. And Moshe is someone that they can see and they can engage. Um, and not having that connection is very disturbing. Um, when we refer back to the beginning of Shemot, it's Moshe who says to God, the Israelites will doubt.
Mm-hmm.
There's at that point no real connection between Bnei Israel and the Sneh, right? It's just Moshe who's at the Sneh. And for Moshe, well, that's something he can see. It's something I would say tangible, but it's not really tangible because it's on fire. But it it appears to me that what's happening after the incident with the golden calf is that there's an understanding that these people need something tangible, something that they can see, something that they can engage with, and that need is served by the Ohel Moed and by the cloud and the fire, and later by the Mishkan. Um, and because there's a realization that they need this,
Mm-hmm.
that it's not enough for them to just believe,
Mm-hmm.
that there's got to be something that they can relate to. Um, and that that's how I see it. I mean, I think the fact that she focuses on seeing is uh, is instructive to us.
Yes. Yeah. Great insights. The number of times we said the word see appear, and it just testifies to the fact that that's kind of our mechanism, that's our verbiage for knowledge and understanding. And so it is absolutely central to building a relationship with God, even a non-corporeal God, this issue of ways to connect and ways to see. So Moshe serves as that in one sense, but then and that's part of, as you said very well, what leads to the golden calf, and then, so to speak, awakens this realization in God to then provide other vehicles of visual intermediary connection. Um, that resonates very much. Yeah, thank you. Joan and Moshe, and then we'll come to Lance.
I would also, he made a good point that they needed something to see, but also they were slaves, what, for 200 years? It's a very hard mentality for them to break. That's
Yes.
the main thing. How I see, I guess I had collectively what post-traumatic stress syndrome. You could
Right.
say that, you know, you know, they had to leave by taking their Egyptian god, the sheep, and put it in, put it by the bed, to denigrate, their god, just to believe that, yet, supposedly Hashem is, he's everywhere, but we don't see him. There's no, so that's why they needed all these, tangible, meetings. Want to say
Yeah.
something?
Yeah. Yeah. I think so. Yes, Joan, please.
I just wanted to say your talk was very good, and I just wanted to add a little point that because whenever I teach literature, I always like to bring it to people's needs, and this is true also about relationships, not just about the relationship with God. That not to express only doubt, but to express a seeking or a desire to have a change.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, relates, resonates very much. That again, that movement from, expressing doubt to seeking. I think in leadership, we're often taught, when someone has a critical comment or a challenge, you have to try to figure out how to leverage that into an investment. If people are complaining, it comes from some aspect of caring and wanting something, and we want to try to help figure out how to help pivot that into more connection. So that resonates very much. And yeah, to Moshe's point also, I think I don't know if I would call it exactly PTSD, but certainly the habituation, multi-generational habituation to slavery makes all these shifts, very, very complex and not easy to happen in even one generation's time. Lance?
Um, okay. My understanding is that God has um, calmed Moses' anxiety by saying that Aaron is going to speak for him. Is that correct?
Yes.
Where do we hear Aaron speak for Moses?
Now you're asking a good question. Okay, let's see. In the beginning, they certainly speak together. Here, Exodus chapter 4, verse 30, if we're sort of looking at the first time as they go down. Um, so just back up a little bit. After God says in chapter 4, Aharon speaks and he'll be with you and speak for you. Moshe goes back to get permission to go from Yitro. He goes. They have the strange episode on the way with Zipporah and the circumcision. God sends Aharon to Moshe. They meet and kiss. Moshe tells Aaron about everything and the signs. They assemble the Israelites. Then it says Aharon repeated all the words that God had spoken to Moshe and performed the signs, and the people were convinced. So that at least that's one first instance where we see Aharon functioning as Moshe's mouthpiece. It's not even to the Egyptians yet. It's to the Israelites.
Okay, and where is Aaron quoted verbatim? In other words, where do we actually hear Aaron speak?
Uh, it's a good question. That I don't
Well,
have at my fingertips.
I have one answer,
Okay.
and that is after the golden calf. Aaron
Yes.
speaks about his experience with the
Yeah.
golden calf. And what does Aaron see?
Let's see. Here we go. Right. So Moshe asks him, "What did the people do to you that you brought this sin?" He says, "Don't be enraged. You know this is a people bent on evil. They said, make a god." And I said, whoever has gold, take it off. That's the passage, as far as I can tell. Well,
No, there's more.
there's more.
The
Okay,
description of the calf coming out of the fire.
hold on.
This is your God.
Okay, yes, Aaron announced Chag LaDonai Machar. Tomorrow will be a festival of the Lord. Oh yes, this is what Rav Scott was saying. Eila Elohecha Yisrael. This is the people. The people exclaim that actually, and Aaron then says Chag LaDonai Machar. Tomorrow will be a festival of the Lord. Is that what you're referring to, Lance?
Um, but no, there's got to be a place where Aaron talks about how he personally he put together the golden calf, and it says the golden calf came out of the fire. Now, is that cast in a mold? I don't think so.
Right. So the narrator says in verse 4 that Aaron cast it in a mold and made it. But then
No,
when
it's
Moshe
later on.
asks him what happens, he says, I threw it into the fire and out came this egel.
Right. Where is that?
That's here. I said to them, whoever has gold, take it off. They gave it to me. I hurled it into the fire and out came this calf, which is not the
Right.
way the Torah describes it when it's narrating it in real time.
Exactly. Now, does anyone take Aaron seriously as this is the truth? I haven't heard any rabbis say that.
Rav Meidan, we studied a few years ago, attempts to synthesize these two approaches. He has a whole thing. It was like half made. He threw it in. He thought it was going to melt, but it actually hit a rock and fell back out hard. It's this kind of thing, but as always with Rav Meidan, it's creative and thought-provoking.
Well, the problem that I have here is that in this whole episode that we're talking about, from the burning bush to Sinai and beyond, really, Aaron plays a very, very minor role. And when Moses comes to ask him, Aaron, what is your side of the story? And Aaron gives Moses his side of the story, which is, well, what really happened was this calf magically appeared. And the only person who could do that really is God, right? So in other words, God created according to Aaron anyway, God created the golden calf. Now, how do you explain that?
Rav Scott has a thought. Go ahead, jump in.
Not about God creating the golden calf, but I would take issue with the notion that Aaron doesn't have an important role here. I think Aaron has a pivotal role here because it's Aaron who has a connection to the people, not Moshe. Moshe barely knows the people. Aaron has been living among the people. He's been part of the people. And I think, the reason that he's Moshe's spokesperson, and most especially to the people, is because he knows them. He can relate to them and they can relate to him.
Scott, it's a great point. I agree with you 100%. The problem I have is that from the point of view of someone in the original audience, Aaron's presence with the people that you've seen correctly is not there. In other words, you are projecting your absolutely excellent thought, and it's excellent thought, onto a situation. And everybody does that constantly. And from my point of view, it's called high altitude thinking. But there's nothing wrong with it. It's great. And for example, King Saul is considered an aggressive depressive or something like that when he deals with David, which is great, except that there are no psychoanalysts around at that time. It's an evil spirit that's responsible for Saul, not some psychological theory. And that one of my major points here is that if you look at the text, it just doesn't add up. In other words, I find a prejudice throughout the Torah, throughout Tanakh, throughout Judaism to this moment against the Kohanim. I'm prejudiced, I'm a Kohen. It's my prejudice. I agree with that.
I'm getting ready for you for Parshat Vayikra.
Yes.
What's
Yes.
that?
getting ready for you for Parshat Vayikra.
Okay.
Once we get into Kohen land, yes.
Right. No, there's absolutely, well, there's what's the priestly scroll versus the holiness scroll, right?
Mhm.
Um, and I think somewhere in there, my buddy Rabbi Zev Farber contends that there is an idea that God cannot be manipulated. It's somewhere in one of his writings. And if you make that assumption, then all of your Mishaberachs and other prayers are just absolutely worthless, meaningless. But I don't know that. And it could well be that they're really meaningful.
That's
For
why you
example,
say them, right?
what?
And that's why you say them, just in case.
Well, no, actually, my concept of praying is prayer is the voice of God. It's musical.
Mm.
And the idea is that you are moved by the music of the Chazan, for example, and by the music of the congregation. I mean,
And
that's
maybe by the
my
words.
take on prayer. But most people's take on prayer is they're trying to manipulate God in some way, right?
Good thoughts. Good thoughts. I see my dad has a hand up also, so we're gonna turn to him. Thank you, Lance, as always, speaking up for the Kohanim. Dad, yes.
I guess this is because I generally read the Chumash in translation. So I never saw or noticed that Moshe hides his face. It uses the term Hester upon him.
Mm-hmm.
I just wonder, is that expression ever used about any other person in the Bible, or the Chumash at least? I mean, when it applies to God, it's a frightful situation.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just wondering, in this case, um, with the Moshe delaying coming down, the people wanted to see his face, and he's hiding his face. So they're afraid, and they might even be angry with him.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Hold on a second. I'm gonna attempt to briefly answer that with a quick little search. Um, in the Chumash, no one ever hides their face other than Moshe and God. And in the narratives and the rest of the way, it doesn't look like there are other instances other than talking either God saying God will, or in the psalmist saying, "Don't hide your face. Why have you hidden your face?" etc. No, it seems like this is a singular occurrence for a human being.
There are times though when Moshe and Aaron fall on their face.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if that's another way of hiding your face.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Good
Um,
imagery to think about. Yeah.
Rob, Stephen, there's
Yes.
a problem here, and the problem of translation, and that is what do these words really mean? And we don't really have the original audience concept in most cases of what these words mean. For example, you find the word eunuch. I think we've had that the other day in Jeremiah 52, as I recall. There was a reference to eunuch, and it usually means some kind of chamberlain. I think that's a mistranslation, maybe even a Christian imposition. But you're talking about translations that can be absolutely crazy. And one of the main ones is Numbers 22:22 with the word Satan. There is an angel there, but there's also the word Satan. Satan clearly means obstacle. It does not mean adversary. It does not refer to a human being. And that's, the Bilam has an obstacle. So
Hmm.
there are many situations like that. And I think that it's very difficult for us to understand much of many of these phrases,
Yeah.
right? Now, I'm saying what your father said is right on. I mean, it's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Great. Yep. Back to Jonah and Moshe for a last thought.
Just a quick thought, Lance, back to you, where you say that Aaron is so not important, but the fact is that Moshe had trouble speaking and Aaron was his speaker. That's a very, very important point, in my opinion.
Well, I agree with you. The problem that I have is just take, for example, the meeting with Pharaoh. And in the meetings with Pharaoh, it seems to me that it's all Moses. Moses speaks to Pharaoh, and where's Aaron? I mean, in other words, you're getting scenes, you're getting pictures of what's going on. But the picture that I'm getting is Moses, Moses, Moses. Yes, obviously there are a few references to Aaron speaking. In one case, we don't believe him, but the other reference that you quoted, absolutely correct, and so on. But I'm talking about in terms of the preponderance of evidence, and the preponderance is not there. And I think there's a reason for that. And of course, my reason is prejudiced because I think that there is an anti-Kahanic position that is in rabbinic Judaism. And my evidence are the Samaritans. Samaritans Jews. The Samaritans have a Kahanic religion. There are Samaritans named Cohen, Cohen. And you know, the Samaritans, they have access to Jordan, to the Palestinian Authority, to Israel, and nobody talks about them. Hey, might they have some idea of what peace is like in the Middle East? No, nobody cares about the Samaritans. Only about a few hundred of them anyway.
I thought they were wiped out. Seemed like,
Nope, nope. They're in Holon and on Mount Gerizim.
or are
But
they Muslim or they have their own religion?
They're Kohanim. They're
Oh.
Jewish.
the thing
But
is,
they don't accept the oral law. They don't even accept the writings and the prophets and that sort of thing. All they accept is the Torah. They have their own Torah, the Samaritan Torah. It's virtually word for word with the rabbinic Torah. How do you explain that? I can't.
but
Explain.
I think that Aaron, the idea that Aaron is there gave Moses confidence. That might be one way that you could look at it.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. I mean, everything you say is correct. I'm saying that there's more than one lens.
Great. Great.
Oh, it's just something about, face. I thought, isn't there a couple of times, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. That, when they destroyed, Sodom and Gomorrah, they told them not to face Sodom and Gomorrah, or not.
Hmm. Hmm.
Other
Yes.
time, pretty sure there's other times the word face is like, when the two angels on the ark, when they didn't have a face of the children.
There's so much there, so much to explore on the kind of notion of faces. Yeah, David L., back on to you for a last thought.
Thank you. Well, Lance, we certainly feel your pain and the
Thank you.
pain of your
Thank you very
tribe.
much.
But I always thought that when it says that Moshe spoke, that we can assume that the voice is really of Aaron.
Wow.
As an ambassador delivering a demarche, certainly in the court of Paro, and where it changes, I don't know. But that's certainly, I thought, the simple reading of the text.
Fascinating. I have no idea if the commentaries generally incline in that direction. You're saying literally when it says, and Moses said, you're imagining whispered to Aaron and Aaron said it out loud.
God tells us how it's going to work.
Yeah. 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 Okay. That's I don't think I ever quite assumed that, and my imagination and curiosity is piqued to explore a little more. It's great. Great. Thank you.
Good point, David.
All right, everybody. Good stuff to digest. Great discussion, and I always feel like I should check my calendar. I think next Monday should be a regular Monday as we go on through close to the end of the book.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep. See you next Monday, if not before. Love to
All
know. Great rest of the week.
Bye,
guys.
Lila Tov.
Live with,